Okay, so we are live. Thanks everyone for coming here today and virtually. So we are very pleased to have Dr. Ting-Fai today at the CEFC Taipei at Academia Sinica to share his presentation, Taiwan Queering Globally. And I will give the floor to Wen Liu, who is the discussant and moderator of the session. She is at the Institute of Ethnology at Academia Sinica. So just I'm just sharing the screen for. Sorry. PowerPoint. So normally we will have, yes, the PowerPoint. And now it's okay. Thank you, Ting-Fai, and thank you, Wendy. Okay, great.
I'll introduce you.
Okay, cool.
Thanks all. Thanks for the invitation from CEFC, and my pleasure to. This one? Oh, that's okay. Okay. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Ting-Fai, who's a lecturer in gender studies at Monash University in Malaysia. And as a trained anthropologist, his research explored configuration of queerness through the lens of race, class, and mobility in different Sinophone communities, including Hong Kong, Taiwan, Malaysia. And his latest work can be found in Sexuality, the Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies, and the Journal of Intercultural Studies. He is also currently the research lead for the Migration in the Asia region portfolio at the Monash Migration and Inclusion Center. And his talk today is called Queering Taiwan Globally. So let's welcome him.
Right, okay, thank you. So do I need to, is it okay? Okay, so, right, okay. All right, okay, so thank you, Wen Liu, for the very kind introduction. Thank you, Nathaniel, for inviting me to give a talk at CEFC. I actually worked part-time for CEFC like many years ago, but in Hong Kong. And Nathaniel and I actually at one point, we live on the same island. We live on Llama Island in Hong Kong. So it's really good, I mean, like to, see friends here in Taipei and to, give a talk in such a friendly environment. Really much appreciated. So, okay, so today my talk is titled Taiwan Queering Globally. Okay, so let's begin. All right. Okay, so so my works have always looked at people's ways of being queer and being Chinese from an Asian and cultural studies perspective. So this presentation brings together my research on different inter-Asian and Sinophone queer formations that have to do in one way or another with Taiwan as a site for transnational engagements. As an anthropologist, I use ethnography, broadly defined, as my guiding method of investigation. While I also analyze cultural texts, I want to highlight that some of the cultural practices that have helped forge many transnational queer connections and the complexities of their workings can only really be revealed through qualitative inquiries. So some of the research has been published or is currently under review, and some of it is still ongoing. So your comments and suggestions are much appreciated. So the awkward encounter between Taiwan, a small island without nation state status, and globalization theories have long generated much anxiety in scholarly discussions, as highlighted in the now classic essay, Globalization and the Insignificance of Taiwan, in which Shumei asks, what do these theories have to offer for the study of a marginal non-Western society, such as Taiwan with no significant international cultural, economic, and political capital to speak of? Conversely, what does Taiwan have to offer for rethinking globalization? So even though the essay was published almost 2 decades ago, these questions are still and in fact becoming more relevant as a whole wave of recent scholarship on Taiwan's various relationships to different parts of the world has recently emerged. What I want this presentation to offer is a queer rethinking of globalization as an empirical process of cultural transformation and as a theoretical paradigm that is useful for us to think about Taiwan's queer connections. So existing scholarship of Asian queer cultures have long included Taiwan, especially in studies responding to globalization theories in the 2000s. However, in these theoretical formulations, Taiwan is often positioned at the receiving end of transnational traffics that localize imported queer products, rather than a site that globalizes other places and queers them. So one of the project's objectives is to demonstrate how Taiwan is productive of local resources that is capable of influencing and queering other places, especially those in Asia. In what follows, I will talk about my current projects on the queer mobilities between Taiwan and Malaysia through an engagement with globalization discourses in the fields of queer Asian studies and Taiwan studies. Since 2019, I have been conducting research in Taiwan and Malaysia, and in the project, I investigate how different forms of mobility, physically, such as migrations of different kinds, and culturally, such as transnational media circulation, have come to shape both the identity of Taiwan as a sexually progressive society and the queer development in Malaysia's Chinese-speaking communities. On the one hand, I argue that the queer development in Taiwan has influenced LGBT communities globally, especially those in other parts of the Sinophone or Chinese-speaking world. On the other, I want to demonstrate that the Chinese-speaking communities in Malaysia are distinctively queer as a result of their historical links to Taiwan. So I will now give a short review of existing scholarship that informs the research and highlight some of the gaps that I will try to fill. The studies presented here are selective rather than exhaustive for the interest of time. So the question of how globalization affects non-Western queer cultures and identities has significantly shaped the development of Asian queer studies since the 1990s. Influenced by cultural theories emphasizing globalization as a heterogeneous process, the field's agenda has over the years shifted from the earlier debates over whether global queering represents one-way westernization to a sustained engagement with cross-cultural frameworks such as hybridity, translation, and appropriation. Antonia Child's essay, on the Tipo lesbian community, was one of the earliest studies that looks at how queer identities specific to Taiwan are implicated in global processes. The study is significant because it demonstrates that the encounter between local practices and global discourses doesn't necessarily lead to the kind of mainstream assimilation or middle-class queer respectability that one might imagine. Rather, the processes could be highly exclusionary. By tracing the Tipo community as a bar culture in the 1990s, Child demonstrates that the identity formation, while resolving around the US butch femme categorical distinction, has provided an alternative social space for working class lesbians who were left behind by Taiwan's economic progress, marginalized by progressive feminist discourses surrounding lesbianism, and in Child's words, subalternized in the imagined global queer community projected by local cultural elites. So Frank Martin's book, Situating Sexualities, offer a more comprehensive analysis of Taiwan's engagements with global queer discourses, resulting in the formation of global mobile sexual knowledge. In examining what she calls the queer moments in the 1990s, the study demonstrates how queer cultural producers in Taiwan, such as and especially writers and literary critics, actively drew on and transformed local as well as global knowledge. In a recent article on Taiwan's queer literature in translation, Min-Chen Lee also looks into the queer moments in the 1990s, and they point out that the transnational visibility rapidly subsided in the next 2 decades. Reading Lee's article along with Martin's book, which were published almost 2 decades apart, raises 2 questions that have temporal and spatial implications. Number 1, so what has happened since the 1990s in terms of how Taiwan's queer cultures encountered globalization? And number 2, while cultural products such as queer novels have an international readership, previous studies of Taiwan's queer cultures have mostly focused on the changes and transformation happening in Taiwan. So are there, and what kind of changes are happening outside Taiwan? So these are the 2 questions that I'm going to think through in the talk. So one example that I'm currently researching, which might marginally address these 2 questions, is GagaOOLala, a Taiwan-based subscription video-on-demand platform launched in 2016, specializing in Asian LGBT content. It is owned by Portico Media, one of the co-founders of the Taiwan International Queer Film Festival. A marketing executive of the company told me in an interview that the Philippines and Thailand are among the largest market outside Taiwan because of the high number of boys' love consumers in the countries. This is they're strategic about it in their marketing, actually. As you can see on the slide, it's the webpage, that the organization of the content, right? So there is a designated section for BL on the website rather than having it part under the gay section. So to effectively tap into an existing and already very, very vibrant Southeast Asian BL markets, the streaming platform has recently produced its own original BL films, and they are all set in Taiwan, as well as co-produce BL content with filmmakers in Thailand that features both Taiwanese and Thai actors. So to help myself contextualize this production and circulation of boys' love, I found my way to a recent essay by Charlie Chung and Adam Detman as one of the first studies that examines the relationship between Thai queer fandom and the political regime. They asked what has made a cross-cultural and intertextual BL fertilization possible in contemporary Thailand, and highlight the potential of BL in challenging the sexual norms and political power there. So the essay really helps me to relate to what seems like a fetishization of the police as a socially repressive mechanism in some of the GagaOOLala original productions, such as Light Xiao Guan, the most streamed Taiwanese BL film in 2021, which tells a love story about a violently abused young man and an undercover police officer. And The Immeasurable, a recently released short film, which is about a socially active university student and a police officer who have opposing political views. So central to the narratives of both films is the question of whether love can eventually transcend differences and conflicts in a divided society. So reading Chang and Detman's piece side by side with this text, it really gives me an idea of the meanings these texts would potentially produce that might resonate with the hopeful politics of young people living in repressive contexts such as Thailand. So before my interview with the marketing executive, I thought these Chinese language queer films would mostly appeal to Chinese-speaking audiences, such as those in Hong Kong and in the diaspora. So GagaOOLala shows that genre can sometimes play a more important role in enabling transnational flows. It also highlights how these global processes involving Taiwan not only happening in relation to the West or the Chinese-speaking world, but Southeast Asia. And through this engagement, a locally distinctive BL culture is cultivated. So another field that informed my study is Taiwan studies, which now actively places Taiwan in global research agendas. With regards to globalization, the question in the last years has radically shifted from speculating whether Taiwan is relevant to theorizations of globalization as raised by Sinophone in the early 2000s, to recognizing it as historically and fundamentally global, from the time of Austronesian dispersal to centuries of serial colonization. This orientation is not simply empirically additive, but methodologically productive, as demonstrated in recent studies constituting what is now articulated as global Taiwan studies. For example, in the not very recent, but special journal issue, Global Island, Taiwan and the World, the editors James Lin, Graham Reed, and Peter Tilley have also demonstrated how Taiwan is unique and a useful site for knowledge production, generating theoretical relevance to understanding marginalized histories and complex identities everywhere. This wave of scholarship is innovative in the use of methods to reposition Taiwan geographically and geopolitically. So central to the approach is in reorientation away from the Greater China framework to other transnational configurations as sites of reference and comparison. To overcome seeing Taiwan as either a separate object of study or a result of Cold War history, Shu Meishi and Ping-Hui Liu in their edited volume Comparatizing Taiwan have argued for the importance of situating Taiwan in relation to other places for self-definition. In doing so, this approach highlights the advantages of bypassing area studies, which grew out of Cold War exigencies, has historically privileged the centering of large nations. And in a position essay published in the inaugural issue of the International Journal of Taiwan Studies, she further elaborated on the potential use of comparative methods for the development of Taiwan studies. She wrote that the implications for studying Taiwan relationally as a site of global processes and a co-producer of these processes are many. Foremost among them is the situating of Taiwan studies within disciplinary formations where the relevance of Taiwan is no longer tied to the concerns of the Cold War or the limits imposed on Taiwan studies. So these interventions to knowledge production about Taiwan are very exciting, but nothing particularly queer. So it is my objective of my research on queer mobilities between Taiwan and Malaysia to demonstrate that queerness can show us how Taiwan has been implicated in certain global and historical processes. Okay, so when reviewing existing scholarship in queer Asian studies, I was really surprised to find out how there are actually very few studies that explore queer people's mobility across different parts of Asia, despite the centrality of debates surrounding globalization to the field's formation and development since the 1990s. While scholars of queer Asian studies have published a lot of discipline-changing works focusing on the flows of cultural products in transforming non-normative gender and sexual formations, they seem to be less interested in looking at the flows of people in these globalizing queer processes, especially across different places in Asia. And on the other hand, in recent debates, there saw waves of scholarship that look at inter-Asian migration and mobile infrastructures, such as those of migrant laborers, marriage migrants, international students, and lifestyle migrants. However, these studies are not very queer, as most do not have an LGBT focus. So to bring queer studies and migration studies together, my research makes a case to argue that mobility is actually central to the queer Chinese identities and activism locally in Malaysia, as well as to the transnational engagements of queer politics between Taiwan and other places. So part of my research traces queer Chinese Malaysian activists who went to Taiwan for different purposes. Many of my research participants said they learned about doing activism in Taiwan and have returned to their home country where they develop ways of queer organizing and strategies for mobilization within the Chinese community there. There is an empirical and historical dimension to the research. I look at LGBT people's movements between Taiwan and Malaysia and the transnational circulation of Chinese queer media, discourses, and social movement tactics, especially since the early 2000s. There's also an anthropological dimension in terms of the method I use. Since 2019, I have been conducting field research in Taiwan and Malaysia and interviewing LGBT Malaysians as well as queer activists from both Malaysia and Taiwan. So most of the following discussion is based on my findings published or forthcoming in the Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies and the Journal of Intercultural Studies, in which I have argued for the significance of Taiwan in the queer development of Chinese-speaking Malaysia. And I have engaged with the recent works in queer Sinophone studies and found them very useful for examining the relationality of Taiwan and Malaysia. In the now classic Visuality and Identity Sinophone articulations across the Pacific, Shumeishi defines the Sinophone as a network of places of cultural production outside of China and on the margins of China and Chineseness. To speak of Chinese language communities outside China as a network of cultural affiliations, the Sinophone exposes the artificial relationship between the center and the margins that reproduces logics that see China as a compulsory referent of Chineseness. With the objective to decenter hegemonic national discourses, it is perhaps not surprising that Sinophone studies has inspired many queer scholars who pose epistemologically similar questions concerning what is considered relationally normal. Given my studies focus of transnational queer Chinese cultures, I find the concept of the queer Sinophone in the works of Howard Chan very useful. It's in one of the first publications that has shaped what is now known as queer Sinophone studies. Chan points out that the productive encounters between the Sinophone and queerness are mutually productive because of their shared commitments to destabilizing normative centers and to building horizontal alliances between marginalized subjects in peripheral places. And he argues that they find the most meaningful articulations in and through one another's, and moreover, they naturalize each other continuously. Media scholar John Wei, in his new book, further draws our attention to the role of mobility in the production of queer Sinophone cultures. He argues that mobility studies and Sinophone studies have found a mutual ground through queer theory in challenging and destabilizing the static and immobile fields of geopolitical boundaries and categories, as well as gender and sexuality. So I'm not using this text simply because they're interesting. They are very interesting, of course, but it is because my data really speaks to the very essence and politics of queer Sinophone studies as the theme of language in relation to movements across peripheral places in the Chinese-speaking world is particularly pronounced in the context of queer Malaysia. And in fact, the ways in which language function in fostering queer relationalities and senses of belonging are not so much exploring queer Asian studies. So this is why I think Malaysia can advance the discussion. For example, my ethnographic engagement with the queer communities in Malaysia tells me quite a different story of social organization from the mainstream narrative about race. It is without question that race has long been central to the organization of Malaysia's social and public lives, as is reflected in the very presence of state-imposed racial categories, namely Malay, Chinese, Indian, and other, so MCIO. According to the 2020 official estimates, the current 29.7 million Malaysian citizens consist of 69.6% Bumiputra or Malay, 22.6% Chinese, 6.9% Indians, and 1% other. Being first a product of colonial modes of knowledge construction in which race is the primary referent of difference, the racial classification of MCIO has continued to define Malaysians as national beings. Not unlike most aspects of society and everyday life, such as work and education, the queer communities are racially marked. Cross-racial interactions across these communities are indeed minimal. However, the structuring principle, I argue, tells quite a different story of social division from that of mainstream racial discourses. In fact, more often than not, language, rather than race, is used as a mechanism of inclusion or exclusion or guiding the cultural orientations in community organizing. This is evident in how some LGBT groups have advertised, not yet, have advertised themselves as language-specific entities, calling themselves a Chinese-speaking, English-speaking, or Malay-speaking group. The use of language, according to Raymond, as shown on the slide, a gay lawyer and co-founder of a Chinese-speaking queer group, has been for him a conscious decision, one that deliberately resists existing paradigms of social difference. He pointed out that the cultures people identified with had more to do with the languages they were comfortable speaking than the racial groups they were born into. As you can see in this quote, the language one speaks doesn't necessarily reflect their racial identity. In fact, many ethnic Chinese people who speak better English than Chinese will usually identify with English-speaking queer groups. This is an accurate depiction, despite himself being an exception. Apart from Raymond, most other Chinese-speaking queer activists interviewed received a Chinese language education in Malaysia and later graduated from universities in Taiwan. In fact, it is not uncommon for students educated in Chinese medium secondary schools in Malaysia to go to Taiwan for university. This is a result of Malaysian public universities not recognizing the qualifications gained from Chinese medium secondary schools and Taiwan's welcoming policy for quote-unquote Chinese overseas students since the 1950s. Yet, this preference is far from a matter of convenience, i.e. who speaks what. It actually has direct implications to their cultural and political orientations vis-a-vis the geographical locations that serve as their points of reference. For example, People in Malay-speaking groups are predominantly Muslims, and they're mostly concerned about religious issues in Malaysia and across the Islamic world, whereas those in English-speaking groups are occupied with quote-unquote liberal issues, a term that was repeatedly used by the activists I have interviewed that surround Western progressive ideas such as drug use. Okay, an example that is also repeatedly given. On the other hand, the Chinese-speaking groups are heavily influenced by the happenings in the Sinophone sphere. To my impression, many participants see themselves as members of the Trans-Asian queer Chinese community than simply LGBT Malaysians. They make yearly trips to Taiwan for the Pride Parade every October. As Shannon, a lesbian educator and another co-founder of the group, pointed out that many queer Chinese Malaysians know more about the queer culture and politics in Taiwan than in their home country. So what I want to point out here is that these linguistic affinities have resulted in multiple trajectories of local queer formations that are fundamentally transnational and multi-directional. Furthermore, queer rights have very often been articulated as ethnic linguistic minority rights. The activists I've interviewed have very consciously made the connection between their marginalized status as queer person and that as a Chinese person in Malaysia. They share a very strong desire to insist on using Chinese as the principle of organization. As you can see in this interview extract by Marcus, an NGO worker who has recently formed a queer Malaysian network in Taiwan, responding to my question about his understanding of race and language. I want to point out that it's also crucial to consider the queer use of Chinese with reference to the marginalization of non-Malay languages in Malaysia. So other than responding to collective traumas, the use of Chinese has also served a pragmatic function in advancing queer activism locally. My data also suggests that the Chinese language serves a very important function for surprisingly obvious reasons. According to Shannon Shah, Islam as a discourse and label is a powerful shaper of policies and public opinions in Malaysia, especially through matters concerning sexual diversity. So the policing of sexual transgressions has long been an effective way for state actors to gain Islamic credential, hence popularity. Under the politicized climate where queerness is rendered incompatible with religious practices, there leaves little room for any public expression of support for the LGBT community. This politically charged homophobic sentiment has been more pronounced since the 1990s, when anti-gay rhetoric and policies were more explicitly and overtly maneuvered by the Malaysian government for its own specific political purposes. This is evident in the sodomy charges made under Section 377 of the Penal Code, which is still currently enforced in the present day, such as the conviction of Anwar Ibrahim, a prominent leader of the then opposition in 1998. So other than targeting politicians and LGBT individuals, the policing of sexuality for political opportunities has also affected the development of queer activism and communities. In Malaysia, most LGBT events, once having reached certain scale in terms of their visibility and number of participants, such as Sexuality Merdeka, an annual sexuality rights festival in Kuala Lumpur, are usually very short-lived due to police bans and confrontations of religious groups. By contrast, the events organized by Chinese-speaking groups have managed to bypass state scrutiny and grow sustainably in the last decade. Pointed out by many activists such as Carlson, who is a counselor specializing in LGBT issues, previously worked for a queer organization in Taiwan. Chinese-speaking queer groups are much less likely targeted by politicians and other state actors because government workers are predominantly Malays and do not understand Chinese. So this again highlights the role and significance of language in advancing queer communities. And I think this can be seen as a kind of pragmatic resistance that really speaks to the scholarship concerning how people do activism in illiberal settings, such as the subjects in the works of Lynette Chua and Audrey Yu. So very self-evident in the previous slides, Taiwan has centrally configured in the backgrounds and accounts of the four activists. And the fact that many of the active participants in the queer Chinese communities previously studied in Taiwan cannot be ignored. Okay. So the Malaysian human rights activist and former student in Taiwan, Zhang Yusan, pointed out almost a decade ago that Malaysian students in Taiwan could potentially contribute to the gender and sexual politics in Malaysia when they returned to their home country. And that was little the former students could do, as they were excluded from involving in social movements at that time, partly because of them not being active in the English or Malay-speaking queer circles. So my research on queer student mobility shows that the situation has changed, and Taiwan has actually played a very significant role in queering the experiences of LGBT students and in turn shaping the sexual landscape in Malaysia. So for example, many interviewees, especially those currently in their late 20s and 30s, told me strikingly similar stories about their coming of age experiences as LGBT adolescents. And they have much to do with the consumption of Chinese language media from Taiwan. These cultural products, such as online pornography, textual or visual, have contributed to the production of cross-cultural desires, and they in turn motivated transnational engagements, such as overseas education. As you can see in this extract of my interview with Samson, recalling his excitement the night before his flying to Taiwan for university. So some even said they were not aware of their sexual orientations before they had access to queer content on the internet in the mid to late 2000s. So this time frame actually coincided with the relatively late popularization of the internet in Malaysia that has been extensively examined by my colleague Susan Young in her book, Malaysian Net. For many queer Chinese Malaysians, the first time they met other queer Chinese Malaysians was in Taiwan. So Fan is a transgender counselor who went to university in Taiwan. During his study, he realized his queer identity and developed an interest in advocacy work. While doing his internship at Taiwan Tongji Hotline Association, a prominent queer organization, he formed a community with fellow Malaysians, and some of them are still very active in Malaysia. So rather than engaging in queer activism, those returned from Taiwan have also been doing various kinds of advocacy work in their everyday lives. As a teacher in a Chinese medium high school, like many former students in Taiwan, Samson has been very active in incorporating gender and sexuality related materials in his teaching due to the flexibility in designing one's curriculum in an institution that is not recognized by the state. Like Van, Samson's experiences in Taiwan had motivated him to challenge the status quo. When I asked him how difficult it was to teach gender and sexuality related topics in his high school, he said that Taiwan has given him a lot of inspiration, especially his style of pedagogy was influenced by his experiences doing queer activism and community work with Hotline, where he learned that the teaching of any gender and sexuality issues should start with telling a life story, 生命故事, so that his students could better relate themselves to the situations and struggles of people affected by gender and sexual norms. 2 months after my interview with Samson and Fan, I made a visit to Hotline's Taipei office to meet with the staff in 2019. And luckily, the member of staff, Olivia, I managed to interview, was involved in organizing the internship program where she got to know Fan. When I asked Olivia why they received so many Malaysian interns that year, she said it was their priority and conscious decision to receive overseas students from countries that lack LGBT-related resources, such as Hong Kong, Malaysia, and China, as they hope their experience working at Hotline would equip them with the skills to do advocacy work in their home countries. While Olivia introduced me to the work of Hotline by guiding me through the various working clusters listed section by section on their promotional leaflets, I noticed the term life story, 生命故事, in the section titled Tongji and Gender Education. And immediately I recall Samson's story about his teaching and asked Olivia whether the term has been used for a very long time. So she said that, okay, so it's a quote, it has been used for a very long time. Life story is about standing in front of the stage. The reason for talking about yourself is because people wouldn't criticize you, they cannot possibly judge your life in front of the audience. I tell my own story. Although some people might not recognize LGBT people, they cannot deny one's life trajectory, deny the fact that one has experienced all this. When you tell your story, it enables people to become more empathetic. Why would you have experienced all this? They didn't understand LGBT people because of the limits of their imaginations. Did you choose to become queer? They had their presumptions. But after hearing these real life experiences, they will understand more about LGBT people's situation. So this, telling a life story requires a lot of practice. We don't just randomly tell a volunteer to tell his or her story. We make sure that they systematically polish their stories before during our weekly meetings. Then we let our committee members listen to the stories and see whether they have difficulty understanding them. Can this be explained more clearly? Is the story told too fast, too detailed? So starting out as literally a hotline for LGBT counseling in 1998, Olivia told me that gender education soon became one of Hotline's prioritized agendas when the Gender Equity Education Act was put into effect in 2004. That was to facilitate school teachers who lack relevant training to implement gender and sexuality related materials in their teaching. Scholarship on transnational queer activism has shed some very important light on how movement tactics are adopted and practiced transnationally. However, most of these studies focus on examining how queer activists and styles of organizing from the West to the non-West and across places within the global North. It is perhaps due to the marginalization of Taiwan in global queer knowledge production, the critical efforts of NGOs and LGBT activists have been seen as merely a local phenomenon. Hence, their transnational impulses are often rendered invisible. So this is despite of Hotline's active attempts to reach out to young Chinese-speaking foreign queer activists. The travel of life story from Hotline's office to Samson School tells a story of globalization from below via a historically particular Sinophone circuit of student migration. So other than student mobility, I'm also interested in the relationship between media and community organizing. I want to build upon the works of Hong Wei Bao, who argues that films and digital videos function as an important way to conduct queer activism and build queer communities, especially in visually underrepresented places in the global South. So I will end this talk with an example. So I found the 2017 documentary on the Way to Blossom by Wong Kai Kwei, a Malaysian journalist and documentary filmmaker who is also a former student in Taiwan, as well as the public discussion surrounding the film, shedding a lot of light on the role of digital video in activism. So On the Way of Blossom depicts the everyday struggles of the Malaysian Taiwanese lesbian couple, Atan and Kai Li, who I have also interviewed during my fieldwork. When the film first came out in 2017, the screenings were limited to small film festivals and for niche audiences before later it found its home on YouTube. But it was not until 2019 when Taiwan legalized same-sex marriage that the film gained some public traction and has been shown at many venues across Taiwan. This is because Atan and Kai Li became the spokespersons of the Taiwan Transnational Marriage Equality Alliance, and they have actively been raising public awareness and fighting for visibility of queer transnational marriage on mainstream media. The 2019 same-sex marriage bill excluded non-Taiwanese partners from countries that don't recognize same-sex marriage. So Atan, a Malaysian citizen, couldn't apply for spouse visa, and the only feasible way for her to remain in Taiwan was to enroll in graduate school and stay on a student visa. So when the film was made, Kai Li, the Taiwanese partner, was still closeted to her parents, while Atan's family has already accepted their lesbian relationship and acknowledged Kai Li as their daughter. So I've shown this film with the filmmaker present in my first year sexuality class for 2 years. And on both occasions, the students were fascinated by the scene where a marriage ceremony is performed at Atan's family home in the state of Perak. Because Kai Li, the Taiwanese partner's closetness, and Atan, the Malaysian partner's family's acceptance, really challenged the students' assumption about social attitudes in the couple's different places of origin, as well as Chinese culture in general. So I think it's important to recognize that apart from the critical efforts happening in advocacy and cultural production, it often comes down to such a reconfiguring of queer identities in often the most intimate setting that facilitate the co-production of Queer Taiwan and Sinophone Malaysia. In this instance, Chineseness that is produced by a non-China-centric relational Sinophone framework can be productive resources to empower LGBT people, especially in the absence of an urban queer culture. So this is the end of my presentation. So thank you for coming. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Yi. That was an amazing talk. And I just have a few comments and some questions, and we'll get a question from the audience as well. So I think the research project is really interesting because it provides, I think, 3 broad interventions in not only sort of queer mobility studies, but also, Sinophone study or transnational studies at large. So there are the interventions from the Sinophone perspective, and the second is from the ethnolinguistic perspective, right? And the third is another way to look at the regional practice of queer Asia. So the first one on the Sinophone intervention. So queer mobility has often been framed in terms of the West versus the non-West, right? And Taiwan's being placed under this pause between Westernization versus localization. But I think your work provides a really interesting case of how Taiwan itself is already globalized, and ways in which it provides, becomes a global circuit for transnational queer mobility, right? So you kind of talked about the significance of Taiwan and Taiwan studies beyond just the sort of familiar Greater China framework or the sort of cultural core framework that's often being understood, in sort of Anglophone literature. So the Sinophone critique kind of provides a different way to look at queer mobility beyond these polarization. And the second one, I think also really interesting, is about that you look at the ethno-linguistic affiliation, I think that's a word you use, versus the Malaysian state-imposed racial category, right? As a way to organize queer Chinese Malaysian solidarity in a way, and they're informed through a lot of the sort of Sinophone cultural production from the 90s to currently, and even the sort of BL market. It's really interesting. It was mostly produced in Taiwan. I didn't know about that. And the third one, which is the regional practice. So obviously the current Taiwanese administration is reaching out more toward the Southeast Asia, right? The whole New South bound policy. But I think your research shows that the exchange have already been happening. It's been happening since the 80s and 90s, and particularly through this queer Sinophone circuit, right? So you kind of provides a really good argument why Malaysia should be looked at, right, in this circuit, rather than, I think when we look at inter-Asia study, we often only look at Taiwan versus Hong Kong, Taiwan versus PRC, or Taiwan versus Singapore. But really interesting, I don't know why Malaysia is often missing in the case. So, so those are really, I think, great interventions in the existing scholarship. And I have 2 quick questions. And one is, you talked about the Chinese-speaking queer group, right? Those were the way that queer activists informed themselves to form groups. But obviously, I think coming from Hong Kong, even Chinese-speaking itself is a contested category, right? Like, is it Mandarin? Is it Cantonese? I wonder if there was similar tension in Malaysia, because I know a lot of Chinese folks spoke Cantonese, right? So just more about that. And also, is this Chinese affiliation or ethno-linguistic affiliation, is there a split between how they feel more affiliation with Taiwan or with PRC? Because I do notice from a lot of the online social network, like from Instagram or whatnot, some of the KOLs, they will use simplified Chinese, Malaysian KOL. So I wonder if you notice any splits between those. And the second question, I think, is just something that often got asked in terms of queer transnational mobility, is the class characteristic, right? In who is able to do this exchange, right? And I'm just wondering, could you talk more about the class dynamics you've noticed in your informant. And you talked about, I think in your paper, right, that they have this queer aspiration about Taiwan, and how much of that is about seeking better life for oneself, like a more sort of, little liberal individualistic way, or I think there's something more, right, about the seeking a better collective linked fate kind of idea. So if you can talk more about that, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Okay. Should we sit?
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you, Wanil, for the comments, and thank you very much for the questions. And I think,
Do you want to speak?
okay, so I hope that you guys can hear me. So thank you very much for the comments, and thank you very much for the questions. And I really like how you articulated the three areas that my research kind of, makes an intervention to. And I think, I didn't articulate in that kind of way. So, thank you for your understanding, and thank you for, letting me know. Okay, I like it. Okay, so the Chinese-speaking groups. Okay, I think I should have, clarified that a bit better. So by Chinese-speaking, I'm actually really referring to Mandarin speaking. Yeah, because even though like in Malaysia, like in Kuala Lumpur, where I conducted my fieldwork, like a lot of people speak Cantonese and a lot of people speak other Chinese languages, right? Other than Cantonese and Mandarin. But Mandarin is actually the language by default in those queer communities. And so while people speak their I don't want to use the word dialect, like quote unquote dialect, within the context of the family or within the context of the communities, they use Mandarin as a way of connecting with other queer people in the community. Like in small gatherings, in one's home. Okay, a lot of so there are a lot of these not really underground, but gatherings within one's home. A lot of people they really use Mandarin as the language to communicate with one another. And I think that's a very important observation, and I should really have made that more clear in my articulation. Yeah, by Chinese speaking, I am really talking about Mandarin speaking. And the ethnolinguistic dimension, you mentioned that you have read a lot of posts online, like by queer people who use simplified Chinese. Yeah, so the thing is that they actually learned simplified Chinese in Malaysia when they went to high school there. It's actually the kind of Chinese they learn to write.
Right.
Yeah, and so some of them actually only learned to write traditional Chinese when they went to Taiwan.
Oh.
Yeah, but maybe I need to ask more. Okay, but to my understanding, simplified Chinese, at least this generation, it's the by default written system that they learn in Malaysia, and it didn't really have that association with the PLC actually. So I think it's also important. I think you made that point really. It's a very important point to distinguish between, so not to have that kind of association, like between the written system and the countries that use that written system, because there are other countries that also use simplified Chinese, but they might not have anything to do with Chinese like PLC influence. So I think that's very interesting. And class characteristics, I think that's another dimension that I should really talk about, because when we talk about queer migration, when we talk about transnationality, we always tend to assume that the subject that we are talking about is a middle class queer subject, like middle class person who can afford to move to other places, just like how capital circulates across borders transnationally, right? But I think what is really significant in my research is that most of the interviewees, most of the informants, I think like maybe most of them fall into the lower middle class category, I would say. Like a lot of them, they go to Taiwan for university because, with that student visa in Taiwan, you could work. Okay, they didn't go to China because you couldn't work. Unless they have, a very good scholarship, which they are getting a lot, scholarships from China. So it's actually a very important reason for many of them. It's the only way for them to survive as a student, to to be able to work, and and many of them are not fluent English speakers, so they wouldn't feel comfortable being in an Anglophone context for education. And also, they cannot afford to go to places like Australia or the United States or the UK. So I think it's an important dimension to look at, like classism. It's so weird because I studied social class and Hong Kong queer culture when I was researching for my PhD thesis. But yeah, I should really incorporate class dimension to that as well, because I think it's really makes a contrast, a stark contrast to the existing works on queer migration and queer mobility. Yeah. And aspirations, queer aspirations, how do they look to the future? How do they as queer Sinophone subjects vis-a-vis Taiwan? I think it's a very I see that as a guiding question. I can't really provide an answer, an informed and meaningful answer now, but it's definitely a guiding question. I think that would guide my investigation as I continue to conduct research. So thank you for this question. Yeah, thank you.
No problem. Any questions from the audience?
Yeah, thank you again, Ting-Fai. It was a beautiful example of Sinophone articulation in the research program. And I really look forward to your next articles. I have two questions, in fact. One is about, because in your research on Malaysia, you show that a lot of people, organizers of the queer community, went to Taiwan. So I think my question is more about, is Taiwan the new place of formation for the organizers of Sinophone queer communities in Asia? That was, in fact, Hong Kong was the same thing for the working class organizers at one point, where I had workers coming to Hong Kong to be formed, to do the formation on the working class, organizations and protests and all that. So is Taiwan doing the same thing, but for the queer communities in Southeast Asia? Well, the Sinophone communities as well. And my other question would be on the BL, because you were talking about my loves. I really love what you're saying about the cultural production of BL in Taiwan being consumed in all the Sinophone communities, Malaysia, Singapore, and all that. I think it's a really interesting point. And I was wondering, the consumers themselves, are they the queer communities, or it goes beyond the queer community? Because from my point of view, BL was in fact created at some point by middle-aged heterosexual women in America as a cultural product. Well, they were fantasizing about Star Trek's characters being in love, male characters being in love, and so I was wondering, in the BL consumers in Asia, or the Sinophone consumers, are they from the queer community, or it goes beyond that?
Okay, so let me answer the second question first, because I'm not a BL expert, obviously. So what I talk about is actually from my recent interview with the marketing executive from GagaOOLala, and it's the direction that I really want to further pursue, because I just found those texts very interesting. Because at first sight they don't look very BL to me. They are not like very young. Like those I don't know. I should really I should like really look at BL productions in other countries before I make that judgment. But what I found interesting is that so the streaming platform is known as an Taiwan-based LGBT focused media, like video on demand subscription kind of platform, right? So I haven't interviewed anybody, any viewers, haven't interviewed any audience, only people in production or people in marketing. Okay, and what I found interesting, what I found significant is that most viewers are actually not Chinese speaking. They're not Sinophone, so in Thailand and in the Philippines. So to my understanding, they are among the largest markets for GagaOOLala. Really to my surprise, because I actually thought it was a very Chinese language dominated platform, right? So, presumably most viewers would be from, other parts of the Sinophone world, like from Hong Kong or people in the diaspora. But turn out people in the Philippines and people in Thailand, they are really into, those content. And those are, countries that have an existing BL culture. They have local productions and, it's actually very vibrant. So like in the works of Thomas Baldenet, he is actually working on Thailand, like BLs in Thailand, and they have their distinctive ways of marketing, like the characters in real life, they I don't know, like fake relationships. They have a name for it. So you see, I am not an expert, but I just think it's very interesting because those texts, right, like those films that are set in Taiwan would actually appeal to non-Chinese audiences. Yeah, and in an already existing and vibrant BL market really tell us something about how these texts are read by the local audience there who are not Chinese speaking. So I think it points to another layer of transnational connections that doesn't even involve the Chinese speaking world, but to Southeast Asia. And I found this really fascinating. And this is something that I would really want to further pursue. And as I have also utilized the works of Charlie Chung and Adam Datman, and I think the context they provide really makes sense to me. How BL can be read very subversively to challenge existing sexual and gender norms, and the featuring of police officers in those films. I mean, like it makes sense, right? Like the question of whether their love can transcend those political differences. I mean, it would resonate if I watched that in the context of Hong Kong, for example. But I think it would similarly resonate people who are situated in the context of Thailand. Yeah, so I think something is already happening, something is already going on. Just requires a bit more investigation, which I plan to do. And in turn, I mean, like through engaging with these overseas markets that are not Chinese, I think they're also developing their own distinctive kind of BL culture. I don't really know, but they are not very young, right? Like BL like representations, they tend to feature men who are like young, right? I don't know. Right?
Yeah, I definitely don't consume.
Okay. All right. Okay. No. I just asking everybody. so not assuming, just asking. It's an open. Yeah. Okay. Right. Okay. So first question. Can you elaborate a little bit on the working class?
Is Taiwan becoming the center of formation of like cadres, if you want, of the organization of the queer community, as Hong Kong was for the working class in China.
Oh, okay. Oh, I see. So, like, as a site for like mobilization. Yeah, I don't think so. I don't think so. I recently read an article by an NGO worker, Chen Naijia from 那个
婚姻平权，
对婚姻
彩虹大。
大平台, and she has an article that talks about Taiwan's international relations with other countries and how it influences other countries, and very different from the homo nationalist politics in Western countries. Taiwan doesn't impose its own way of this legal context, legalization on other countries. It doesn't teach people what to do, but in other ways through engagements with different NGOs transnationally, they are influencing other people, but not in a top-down kind of way. So I don't think it really sees itself as a center for that kind of intervention. But what I found very interesting is that it's not like that. I think if we look at activism, in a more like broadened kind of way, like Taiwan Tongji Hotline, I mean, like it's not really publicized. I mean, the kind of transnational works. That's why in the beginning of the talk, I said that some of these dynamics, some of these connections can only really be revealed ethnographically. You really need to talk to the people. You really need to look for clues in their narrative, like Seminggusi is actually, a big clue for me to link up, what is happening, in the two places and the historical aspect of it as well. So I think it's a different kind of way of connecting and assisting or facilitating other communities like Sinophone community, queer communities in other places. So it's not like anything very celebratory. Okay, even though I think it's not like that. I think like if I were to tell a story, I think it would be a story of a lot of undercurrents that are happening, but not so explicitly. So I think this is why ethnographic work is important, because it kind of reveals those things that are hidden by mainstream discourses. It's not anything mainstream, but they are happening. They are changing in the context of my research. The Chinese-speaking communities, queer communities in Malaysia, are in a kind of I wouldn't say indirect, but in a kind of not hidden, but in a not as explicit kind of way, and it's not intentional. It's quite organic, I think, and that's why I found it interesting. Yeah, it's not like campaign. You should do things like us. Yeah, that kind of dynamic. Yeah.
Hi, Audrey. Thank you so much for such a very chock-full kind of talk, very, very rich for me. And I think I'm really intrigued by the fact that in your publication, you chose kind of to focus on students and the kind of like return, the back and forth migration, I suppose, the kind of the certain identities that come with that, and like the room for different kinds of I guess activism and mobility, whether in Taiwan or Malaysia kind of thing. So I have two kind of main questions regarding that. And so one is a smaller one. The first one is with regards to your respondents. I'm wondering, kind of touching on the class element too, I'm wondering with like the scholarships that they receive, because I know that with Malaysian students, you can kind of choose either to come in as a foreign student or as a Chao Sen, right? And so of course there are different kind of ideological baggage associated with that. But I wonder also potentially if that's connected to the English-speaking, Chinese-speaking kind of element as well, because probably kind of the program that they enroll in is going to be different, and the kinds of things that they are able to participate in once they get to Taiwan is probably going to be different. But I'm wondering if you could elaborate more on that. And then the other thing I noticed too as well is I just wonder, because most of your respondents you spoke to them in Kuala Lumpur, so you wouldn't like they might provide less information about what their activism while they were in Taiwan kind of thing, right? Because the student identity, right, according to what I know as well, is there are limitations with regards to the kinds of things that you're allowed to do, whether on a cultural kind of aspect or with certain restrictions that are put on the visa kind of thing, right? Because you're technically not supposed to participate in protests, or else you could be deported. There are different limitations as to what they can do in Taiwan on political end. And then as well, kind of, I'm also wondering if they express any sentiments about being, because it seems a lot that they come to Taiwan and their position is one kind of learning, of acquiring resources that they can take back to their home countries and can make use of there. And it seems like the approach of GagaOOLala is very much like that, where we want to equip them and we want to send them back. But the ability for them to either assume positions of leadership or of kind of being really involved in organizations in Taiwan is actually pretty limited, either by their cultural understanding of the local Taiwanese context and how the Tongsu movement evolved, for example, or by other different things like their accent or by their ability in Chinese, for example, which would be different from people who are educated in Taiwan, kind of thing, right? And so, yeah, I'm just wondering about those two elements.
Okay, I think yeah, very interesting questions that I didn't really think about, and thank you very much. Actually, thank you very much. Yeah, I know that the students, they can choose different status when they apply to universities in Taiwan. They have this quote unquote Chinese overseas Chinese category, and they have this international student categories, and they have direct implications in terms of
tuition.
the extent to which they are governed by different policies. And surprisingly, these information never really explicitly conveyed to me by my interviewees. I don't know whether it is because they don't really bear much relevance to their experiences here, because I mean, for many of them, it's just a way, a strategy to go overseas to study. And even though they kind of assume, I mean, from the perspective of authorities, they assume you to be a certain kind of subject, to be kind of Chinese overseas subject, but I don't think it's so relevant anymore. It's a historical legacy if we think of it that way, if you apply as a Chinese overseas student. So maybe it kind of indicates the absence of information from the side of my interviews. Maybe it indicated it doesn't really matter to them. It's just a strategy, it's just a way for them to get here, and it doesn't really play a role in their queer identity. So it might be an explanation, but this is something that I should really pursue in my investigation. And the second, I think that's another research project, right? It's more like a division within the queer movements in Taiwan, and the division between local people and but even within the local, I mean, there are a lot of dynamics and a lot of divisions. So identity politics that involve a transnational dimension, I think that is probably a different research project. And I think it's quite obvious that it's more, like the influences of Taiwan on Malaysia than, Malaysian students on Taiwan. But there are things happening. I mean, they are not anything confrontational, as you have kind of described, like, social organizing, like gathering with, other queer Malaysians. So I have been attending like a gathering network, a network of the interviewee that I have discussed in the talk. So he has this, Malaysian networks to, as a way, as a kind of empowerment, because many of them are students and many of them are quite young. And as you said, they face problems too because of their accent, because of, not having a lot of resources here. So there are these things happening, but, there are, of course, divisions. There are, of course, a lot of conflicts within the local queer community. And I think a lot of people are doing that kind of work. And I think that should be, another project to look at, the tensions between local queer Taiwanese and foreign queer people here. Yeah, I think, that should be like more work on that, more research on that. Right? Yeah, I know works that deal with, foreigners and foreign activists and local activists in Hong Kong, but are there any works that?
Especially Sinophone.
Yeah, but I don't think I have encountered any. No. Yeah.
Any other questions from the audience? Yes.
Justin.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ting-Fai, for this great presentation. It's just like I'm not really from the queer studies area, so I don't have very interesting things to say at that point. But it's just when you were talking about this, the featuring of police officers in these movies you were talking about, and it immediately made me think of the Bonbon Tigo. The movie?
Yeah.
Where it's all about this guy trying to seduce a police officer near Zhongnanhai in Beijing. And I mean, in the context of the 90s, it's a very political, interesting stance, I guess. Yeah, so I immediately formed thoughts about this kind of boy love. Also, that could be featured side of
I see. Yeah. I was so I only watched the films very recently because they just, so the Immeasurable only released like 3 weeks ago, I think.
Wow.
And I was watching that with Xiao Guan, both films, they are like both popular films, like currently popular on the platform. They both have a police officer, and I was like thinking, okay, why do they fetishize the police so much?
Right.
Yeah. Why is that? I don't. and then I read Charlie Chung's and Adam Datman's article, and then it kind of makes sense to me, right? That why they have this market in Thailand, and why they're producing original contents to to tap into that market. Maybe it's a strategy. I don't know, but it doesn't matter. I mean, I'm reading the text rather than reading and motivation in this context. But I think it certainly produced, certain meanings, because those texts that are locally specific, I think, like, in the protest, one partner is a police officer and the other a politically active student fighting for, different rights. It's very Taiwan also. Taiwan is like very divided, and like other Asian countries, right? So I think it would, generate that kind of meanings. I think the more meanings you generate, the more popular text is really. And, I think it would resonate with young people. I don't know. I think maybe I should do some interview, but I think it would, yeah, I think there are something there, like in the undercurrent that is ongoing, that makes these texts popular in Thailand and the Philippines. And that might be,
yeah. I just thought about GagaOOLala's work, the erotic fetishization of uniforms.
Oh my God! Wow. Okay.
And particularly for Taiwanese men, they had to serve in the military, right? So there is a common memories of homosocial socializing. Yeah. So maybe there's a connection.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I remember I attended a book launch. I think GagaOOLala's edited. And Guan Quan. Okay, the BDSM novel, Jun Quan. Sorry, my Mandarin is still quite bad. Sorry, Jun Quan. Sorry. So, oh my God. Okay, so Jun Quan. Okay, so the BDSM novel, right? That the very famous one. So a chapter is like a selection of that novel is translated into English, and the author of the book, so I attended the book launch on YouTube, and he said something very interesting. He said because of military training in Taiwan, it's very hierarchical, so you learn to follow orders, you learn to be subordinate to people who are your senior. So his point is that Taiwanese people, they're very good at BDSM because like guys they have undergone such training, and I think the kind of uniform argument that you have just mentioned, it's kind of something very Taiwanese, I think. I think that serves as the kind of context, right? Like discipline, and it has that.
And for lesbians, it's like gender specific schooling experiences in a lot of novels, like 女校, yeah. So we have time to take one more comment or question. Anyone around? Yes. No?
Okay, so thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming to the talk.
Coming.
Thank you, Dr. Yu.
Yeah, thank you.